class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing another couple of trades made by Sharks general manager Mike Grier. He has been exceptionally busy over this last week, making moves left and right, but the biggest one likely coming here today as the Sharks have traded up in the 2024 NHL entry draft by packaging the 14th overall pick acquired from the Pittsburgh Penguins in the Erik Karlsson trade with the 42nd overall pick acquired from the New Jersey Devils in the Timo Meier trade. The Sharks have managed to pry away the 11th overall pick from the Buffalo Sabres. Now, this might seem like a small overpayment to move up just 3 spots in this year's draft in exchange for an early to mid-second rounder like the 42nd overall pick. Might seem like it was a bit too much value to give up, and perhaps in a vacuum that would be the case, but in this draft in particular, there was a very important line, a very important threshold for San Jose to cross, and this trade definitely does accomplish that. You see, once the Sharks grab Macklin Celebrini at first overall, their top 3 prospects will be Celebrini, Will Smith, and Quentin Musty. What these 3 players have in common is that they are all forwards. In terms of defensemen, while the Sharks do have players like Mukhamadullin and Thrun and perhaps even the dark horse of Luka Cagnoni, none of those defensemen necessarily scream, at least not certainly, top pairing defensemen in the future for this organization. So for this 2024 draft to be a big success for the Sharks, it feels as though they needed to grab a big name, high ceiling defenseman in the first round. At 14th overall, it was certainly possible that they could get someone of this caliber. Jiricek would have almost certainly been available. I know a lot of Sharks fans were also looking to be able to grab Stian Solberg at 14th overall, but those are smaller ceiling. Those are players who aren't necessarily as much of a high chance. Many scouts believe that this draft has a top 6 group of defensemen with really high potential, and after that is a bit of a drop-off. And it was likely that once the Sharks were on the clock at 14th overall, that all 6 of those defensemen would be off the board, the last of which expected to be Carter Yakimchuk, going in like the 12 to 13 range. So by the Sharks moving up from 14 to 11, the likelihood of at least one of these defensemen, perhaps even a couple of them, still being on the board at that selection has absolutely skyrocketed. With the decent still caliber of forwards available in the top 10, we know Celebrini's going first overall, but there's also players like Demidov, Katin, Iginla littering that top 10. The Sharks may even have a decent choice at that 11th overall pick. So it makes sure that the Sharks will get a high ceiling defensive prospect, while at 14th, that was not very much a guarantee. The other interesting oddity about this trade, however, is the fact that it is happening the day before the draft. Most of the time, when teams move up in a particular draft, they're doing so on the day of that draft. We look back in 2022, this was a trade-down trade for San Jose, but when they made that move with the Arizona Coyotes to go from 11th overall to 27th overall, it happened on the day of the draft. Usually it's when a team realizes that the guy they want is likely to be available a couple of spots later, or they're just not particularly interested in who is available at that time. They're willing to make that trade in pretty much in the moment. For San Jose to premeditate this and have it made the day before is quite interesting. Now, there might not be anything here. Maybe Mike Grier just wanted to get it done so that they can have a clearer plan heading into tomorrow. But my thinking process here is that Mike Grier is not done, and that he will look to move up even further in this draft, perhaps to get like the 8th overall pick from the Seattle Kraken or the 7th overall pick from the Ottawa Senators, whether those are available for him. And the thing is that on the day of, it is a lot smaller pill to swallow for a team like Seattle to drop from 8th to 11th compared to dropping from 8th to 14th. And so, if Mike Grier does have a particular one of those 6 defensemen in mind, perhaps a Zane Parik or a Ziv Buyem, who he doesn't believe will be available at 11, but that he might be able to snatch up at 7th or 8th, that could be a trade that Mike Grier will make, and he may even be desperate enough by moving the 33rd overall pick, which is essentially a late first rounder since it is the first pick of the second round, to make such a trade happen. We shall see what happens. These next I'd say 48 hours will be extremely interesting from a San Jose Sharks perspective, but at the very least, this 11th overall pick does more or less guarantee the Sharks will get a very good defenseman if they go that route. I know there's been some talkings about going for best player available, and that may very well end up being a forward, but it feels as though a defenseman should be in the cards for San Jose, and 11th overall will likely get them a very good one. Now, there was another trade made today, of course, lost in the fanfare of that moving up deal, but the Sharks trade defenseman Kyle Burroughs to the Los Angeles Kings in exchange for forward Carl Grundstrom. Now, this is just a deal that generally makes sense for San Jose to make. Even before the acquisition of Jake Wallman a couple of days ago, it was a struggle to really fit Kyle Burroughs into the Sharks' top six. If San Jose really wants Shakir Mukhamadullin to make the jump to the NHL next year, and especially if they were to bring back Ty Emberson, there really was just no room for Kyle Burroughs, and adding Jake Wallman just specifically added to that. Burroughs would end up being like the 9th defenseman on the team, pretty much never getting any playing time. So what's the reason for actually keeping him around at that point? Send him off to another team where he might be able to get a bit more playing time. Now, to bring in Carl Grundstrom, you might be thinking, well, isn't there also a bit of a traffic jam at forward? Well, there is an interesting part to note here about this deal, is that Carl Grundstrom is a restricted free agent. He is actually not under contract at this point, which means if the Sharks really want to, they could simply not sign him and have this trade be just a situation of dumping a contract. It's not as though Kyle Burroughs actually had much value at all. Any straight up trade for an asset would be for like a 7th round pick at maximum. So being able to just have this deal be get rid of a contract that's on the team and free up a slot is honestly not really all that bad of a move. However, Grundstrom is still a rather serviceable bottom 6 player, was relatively decent on a strong Los Angeles Kings team, so he could be someone that the Sharks would want to keep around. But with the recent additions of Goodrow and Dellandrea and Afanasiev, who may very well get some NHL playing time, you're really making the available group of players larger and larger to play for a smaller and smaller amount of spots in the Sharks' top 12, especially when you also consider Will Smith signing his contract and the likelihood that Celebrini comes over to the NHL as well, which makes us question how the Sharks' current RFA group actually matches up against them. I had originally thought that both Luke Kunin and Zadina would inevitably end up back on the San Jose Sharks, back in teal, but with all of these additions for the team, it is very possible that one, if not both of them, end up going unsigned. Now, I would realistically be celebrating the fact that the Sharks will move on from Luke Kunin. I certainly hope that that ends up being the case, but Filip Zadina might be slightly sadder. While he's not necessarily a big loss if the Sharks do decide to not re-sign him, you know, he was a decent enough player, but it seems the Sharks are heading into the future with bigger and better things. Players like Dellandrea and Carl Grundstrom not only proved themselves to be solid bottom 6 players, but they were proving that on good playoff teams like the Dallas Stars and the Los Angeles Kings. And if the Sharks want players who know how to have success at that point, players like Zadina and Kunin aren't really those types of guys. So the Sharks might really be going through a complete overhaul of their bottom 6. And so this trade, I think, is not anything amazing, but it's a decent deal for San Jose. And with the trade up as well in the draft being a really good one, it was yet another day of a bit of tidy work here for Mike Grier. Class dismissed.